Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Feel free to comment below, and in the description you'll see links to my Patreon, my blog, my Discord, and my social media. Today I'm starting a new series on Marxist economics, or Marxist political economy. I'm gonna be using a textbook from the Soviet Union from 1954. It is simply called Political Economy, a textbook issued by the Economics Institute of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. And I think it's a very good textbook. It starts with chapters about the economic modes of production before capitalism. So it talks about basically the history of what existed before and where capitalism came from, what types of economies existed before capitalism. Then it talks about the capitalist economy, and then the end portion of the book, the third part of the book, is about the socialist economy. If you want to read along and you want to read the whole thing, that's great. The book is available online. I will put a link in the description where you can read it. However, it shouldn't be necessary to read the full book to follow along. I'll try to make these videos so that reading it won't be absolutely necessary. If you want to read a book on Marxist economics, I heavily recommend reading something like this, rather than what people usually do, which is either read Marxist Capital or read something more simple from Marx, like Wage, Labor and Capital, or Value, Price and Profit, or something like that. And the reason why I would recommend a textbook like this rather than those texts by Marx is because Capital is not only very long, but it's also quite difficult. I think every communist at some point has to read Capital and has to really study Capital, but it's not a good place to start. If you don't know anything about Marxist economics, or if you know very little, Capital just isn't the best introduction, in my opinion. It takes so much effort to read, it's so long, and it's also so incredibly deep and such an amazing work that it takes like 10 times longer to read it because you're just rereading it, and there's so much information in Capital. And those shorter texts like Wage, Labor and Capital, Value, Price and Profit, those kinds of things, which are little pamphlets, the problem with those is that they, on the other hand, are way too short and way too simple. They only scratch the surface of a couple different things. So I would recommend something like this textbook on political economy. This is long enough and it deals with pretty much everything that you would want. It gives a historical overview, it deals with wages, profits, accumulation, rent, merchant capital, merchant profit, loan capital, banks, interest, circulation of money, economic crisis, international markets, monopolies. It covers all the relevant topics, and it's still simple enough that pretty much anybody can figure it out. It's way easier than Marxist Capital. But you still gotta pay attention, and if you don't understand something, then you can post a comment and ask, or just go back and watch again, or go back and read again. And if you do decide to actually read the whole book, then I think you definitely need to read it from beginning to end. You can't skip to the middle or skip to the end or something. No, you have to read it from the beginning. Because if you don't understand the logic of how economies develop, or if you don't know what happened before, you're not gonna get it. Or, for instance, people might be just interested in what a socialist economy would look like. But the problem is, if you don't understand Marxist economics, then you're not gonna get much out of it. So you have to read the parts before, where it actually explains economic theory, and then you can go forward and see how that applies to socialism. So that's that. Now, I'm not really gonna quote anything from the introduction of this book. I'm just gonna summarize some important points raised in the introduction, and also some other relevant points. What exactly is political economy? People don't really talk about political economy as much these days. They just talk about economics. Basically, to put it really simply, political economy studies productive relations, how things are produced, how they are distributed, and how people are organized in relation to each other and in relation to production. Are there slaves and slave owners? But that's a question of political economy. Do people produce with primitive handicrafts implements, or do people produce with big factories? That's a question of political economy. Is there private property or is there no private property? Are there poor workers and rich employers, or is everybody a worker? That's a question of political economy. When things are produced, how do we share what is produced? Does everybody get the same amount? Or is there one class of people who gets the vast majority of what is produced in society, of the social wealth that is produced? How things are produced, how the social wealth is distributed, how people are organized in production. So you can see how it very easily gets political. There's 3 concepts that you should keep in mind. There is productive forces, productive relations, and a mode of production. Productive forces means raw materials, tools, and also people. The most basic kind of productive force is just the people themselves. You know, in the very beginning of humanity, there were no tools, there were just the first humans. They collected different kinds of food with their bare hands. Eventually they invented different kinds of tools and they started using raw materials. Those are all forces of production, or productive forces. Productive relations means how people are organized. So in a hunter-gatherer society, everybody would be hunting and gathering, so that would be the productive relation. Everybody works together. In a slave-owning society, the productive relation would be that some people are slaves and some people are slave owners, and some people are probably neither. And the productive forces, together with productive relations, they form what is called a mode of production. So a mode of production is just productive forces and productive relations together. And Karl Marx, he figured out that certain kinds of productive forces, they tend to create certain kinds of productive relations, which then unite to form a mode of production. For instance, in the hunter-gatherer stage, because of the low level of productive forces, the fact that there were no machines, there were only the most primitive tools, there was no cattle, there was no farming, nothing like that. The productive forces were almost non-existent. So as a necessary consequence of that, people simply had to live in groups because that was the only way to survive. Otherwise they would starve or they would be killed by a wild animal or something. Trying to hunt a mammoth or something, you would need a large group of people. So simply due to the undeveloped level of productive forces, the production relation that they had was an inevitable outcome. In that circumstance, you couldn't have any other type of society. The only kind of productive relation that you could have was that everybody worked together in groups. Otherwise, you would just die, you would starve or be killed. Those types of productive forces, they created a type of mode of production. And slowly over the course of history, very slowly at the beginning, the productive forces develop, so you get better tools, people figure out better techniques of hunting, they invent the bow and arrow, they invent different kinds of fishing nets and ceramics and better tools, and slowly it becomes possible to do different things. And as a result of the productive forces developing, the mode of production also becomes to change. So that's how you go from hunting and gathering to these nomadic tribes who are mainly herding cattle or raising cattle, for instance. And with cattle raising, that's when for the first time you start to have this accumulation of wealth, because cattle becomes a form of wealth, it becomes a form of private property, and then people can accumulate that. You start to get division of labor, and you start to get trade, and then eventually you get cities and all kinds of things like that. So that's why this book also talks about history, because Marx basically figured out how the productive forces, they kind of determine the mode of production, On numerous occasions in this book, it talks about how the mode of production has to be in accordance with the forces of production. Just to give you an example, when cattle raising was invented, the hunter-gatherer tribe had to be abolished. Of course, that happened very, very gradually, but it just had to happen because now that there were these new productive forces, the old hunter-gatherer society was just in such huge contradiction with the new productive forces that it just had to come to an end. It was totally unsustainable. And for Marx, it's the same with basically every mode of production, but in particular, he talks about capitalism. How capitalism has already made it possible and even necessary to abolish capitalism, because capitalism has created these huge productive forces. We have these huge factories and all this technology, and capitalism was useful because it helped to create those productive forces in the Industrial Revolution. But now capitalism has all these problems like global economic crisis and now a global pandemic, and not to even mention climate change, where capitalism cannot fix these problems, and capitalism has actually become a hindrance for societal development, and we don't need it for anything anymore. We already have everything that is necessary to move beyond capitalism to socialism. Capitalism has all these massive economic crises and stagnation and all these problems precisely because the forces of production are not in accordance with the mode of production. The forces of production that we have right now already make socialism possible and already make socialism necessary. Socialism doesn't have economic crisis. Socialism doesn't have homelessness. Socialism doesn't have unemployment. Socialism doesn't have market bubbles. It doesn't have any of these insane problems that capitalism has, because in socialism the forces of production are in accordance with the mode of production. So you can see how it's political. For Marx, the mode of production and the productive forces, they form what is called the base, the economic base, and then on top of that arises a societal superstructure, an ideological superstructure. So what that means is that how things are produced and how production is organized and how the wealth is distributed and shared and whatnot, that creates and facilitates and necessitates certain kinds of governments, for instance. You know, in the Middle Ages, when the aristocracy basically owned all the production, they had all kinds of privileges that the law said. According to the law, this aristocrat has all these privileges and this aristocrat has a local monopoly. But when capitalism developed, all those laws were abolished because they were a hindrance to capitalism. They had been useful and necessary for feudalism, but for capitalism they were a hindrance. In capitalism you have different kinds of laws, something like patent laws, for instance. Patent laws or intellectual property laws and things like that, they say that if you invent something, nobody else can use it unless they pay you. Or how in societies which relied on slavery, slavery was legal. Different kinds of modes of production require different kinds of government organizations, different kinds of laws, different kinds of culture, different kinds of ideology and propaganda. The culture in slave societies always tried to justify slavery, whereas the culture in capitalism tries to justify capitalism. And a lot of it is not even done on purpose, it's just an automatic result. You know, people who always lived in slavery, they're used to it. They can't even imagine anything different a lot of the times. Of course, some people always did, but for many people, they just think that it's natural. Just like now, in capitalism, many people think that capitalism is just something natural that has always existed and is even the only possible type of society. And that's why it's so important that this book talks about history, because it shows that capitalism is not the only mode of production. There's something that Marx calls the opposite of political economy. He says that he says in Capital that political economy studies the real productive relations and how things really are, but the opposite of that is vulgar economy. And vulgar economy doesn't study the real relations of production. It only studies the most trivial, surface level, superficial things. Stuff like what is the typical price of this commodity in a society, or how to best run a business. Those don't reveal what is actually going on in a society. They just basically take all the existing relations as self-evident. They don't question them at all. It doesn't ask any of the big questions like, where does property come from? Do we need private property? What is the actual function of money? What is the source of value? Where do prices come from? It doesn't ask those kinds of questions. Or if it does, then it just gives completely BS answers. For instance, vulgar economy might say, well, prices are determined by supply and demand. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that if there's more demand, then prices go up, and if there's less demand, then prices go down. Well, yeah, okay, you're describing what makes them go up and what makes them go down, but where do they come from, or what even is a price? Well, vulgar economy doesn't really explain those types of things, and it's propagandistic. So, vulgar economy cannot ever reveal the truth because it has to try to romanticize the currently existing capitalist economy. Vulgar economy acts like capitalism has always existed and capitalism always will exist, and capitalism is the only suitable economic formation, and it's either invented by God himself or it's the only one suitable to human nature and stuff like that. That's why vulgar economy is completely anti-historical. It pretends that there either were no other economic modes of production before capitalism, or that every mode of production has actually been capitalism in some form. In order to do that, vulgar economy has to pretend that even hunter-gatherers somehow were capitalists, and even in the Middle Ages there was capitalism. And they get to that usually by defining capitalism extremely loosely and imprecisely, and just instead of explaining anything, they mystify everything. So vulgar economy typically says something like, capitalism just means free exchange. So at that point, it's not even a mode of production anymore. It's only a type of exchange. So any time that there's been free exchange, that's supposedly capitalism. And what constitutes free? Who knows? So basically anything can be capitalism at that point. Whereas in actual fact, capitalism is not a type of exchange, it's a type of production. It's a mode of production where you have capitalists who own production facilities, like factories for instance, and then they employ workers to work for them and produce commodities, goods which they sell on the market to get profits. This is something that Marx talks about in Capital, how vulgar economy likes to do these Robinson Crusoe type of two people on a deserted island types of examples, where they pretend if there's two people on a deserted island, like one guy has coconuts and the other guy has bananas, and then they exchange them, well, that's capitalism. Even though that example doesn't tell us anything about production, although presumably it would be hunter-gatherer type of production. And if they simply exchange different kinds of fruit with each other, well, that's pretty far from capitalism. Capitalism has what is called generalized commodity production, which means that most things, almost all things, are produced for exchange or for sale, whereas in ancient societies that's not the case. Only very rarely were things exchanged or produced for exchange at any rate. And that example with coconuts and bananas, that doesn't even have money, whereas money is a very important part of capitalism. You need to have money for capitalism to be possible. Maybe the best example of the dichotomy between political economy and vulgar economy is the question of value. Political economy always tried to figure out where value comes from. What is the source of value? The goods that we buy, the social wealth, is worth something, it's valuable. But what creates that value? Classical scientific political economy argued that the source of all value has to be work, human work. This was theorized by all the greatest classical economists, so this is what Adam Smith argued, this is what David Ricardo argued, and Marx finally solved all the problems, and he created a labor theory of value that really explains things and works. But ever since then, capitalist economics has moved further and further away from political economy more and more to simply vulgar economics. These days, all the mainstream economics that they teach in school, it's all vulgar economy. It never asks what is value and where does value come from. I mean, they do, but not really, because they say that value is subjective. So because they can't answer the question, because that would lead to undesirable answers, it would basically lead them on the path towards Marxism. So they have to say that value is not objective, it's not something you can measure, it's not something you can detect, it's simply subjective. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. So vulgar economy, it just takes all these things completely at face value and just accepts them and treats them like they're completely eternal and you don't need to ask any further questions. See all these rappers who have like big stacks of money, big stacks of bills, and people romanticize that. They think, oh yeah, I got so many of these paper bills because these paper bills are so valuable. But why are they valuable? That would be a question that political economy has to answer, but vulgar economy doesn't answer that. Vulgar economy just accepts, oh yeah, these little paper bills, of course they're valuable, because they just are. There's all these libertarians who have these kind of conspiracy theories about how the national bank is just somehow evil and they don't want to use the gold standard because of some nefarious conspiracy or something. And they link all the problems of the world to the fact that we don't have the gold standard anymore and that there's a Federal Reserve, because they don't understand where gold money came from and they don't understand what happened to it, where paper money came from. All those questions will be answered in this book. Lastly, I will just reiterate that there are many kinds of modes of production. To be specific, there are 5: primitive mode of production, slave-owning mode of production, feudal mode of production, capitalist mode of production, and then socialist mode of production. So capitalism is not the only one, it's only one of many, and humanity needs to go through all of those, starting from primitive, going through slavery and feudalism to capitalism, and then finally socialism. It is not necessary for every single country to go through all of them. For instance, there's still people today living in primitive communal societies, and many of them will jump directly to feudalism or directly to capitalism because capitalism is already so widespread that, it's already pretty much dominant in the world. So it's not necessary for every single country and every single territory to go through all of those in order, but as a planet, as a humanity, it was necessary to go through all of those. Every different mode of production has its own specific economic law, which basically governs the functioning and governs the development of that mode of production. In capitalism, the basic economic laws would be something like goods are produced almost exclusively for sale on the market for the purpose of getting profits. Production is done in private companies owned by capitalists by the use of hired workers, and production is governed by mindless, chaotic market forces. What is produced is determined by the market, if it's profitable or not. In socialism, there are different basic economic laws, such as what is produced is determined by an economic plan, not by mindless market forces. There is no exploitation, there's no private property, there's no economic crisis, no anarchy of production. Every mode of production has these basic economic laws which are different. However, there are also certain economic laws which are the same across several or even all modes of production, such as it is necessary to do work, it is necessary to produce things, Those are probably very self-evident, but I can't really think of any better examples right now. But anyway, that's my little introduction. I thank you for watching, and next time we will get into Part 1, Pre-Capitalist Modes of Production, Chapter 1, the Primitive Communal Mode of Production. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.